All right, this is lecture number 2 for IB 20th Century World Topics. The title of this lecture is called The Rights of War, the Christmas Truce of 1914, and the Nature of World War I Warfare. So just a quick introduction to give you some context as to what to expect from this lecture. The lecture is going to be based off of the book The Rites of Spring, The Great War and the Birth of the Modern Age. It's by a man named Modris Eksteins. Just to let you know, I'm pretty awesome at mispronouncing things, so I'm probably mispronouncing his name. But something important to note is that Eksteins is a cultural historian, so therefore this lecture will focus primarily on the nature of trench warfare and how that affected the attitudes and values of the people on and off the battlefield. If you want to break this lecture up into a couple categories or themes, the first theme or category we'll look at will be the Christmas Truce of 1914, and we'll look at why did this happen and what laid the foundation for this Christmas Truce. The second one will be a new type of war, so looking at the nature of trench warfare. And then the third part is a technology assignment that is associated with this, the practices of war part of the unit, which you guys looked at in class, and it discussed the significance of technology in determining the outcome of World War I. So our focus for today, I'd like to start off with a quote by an English politician, Benjamin Disraeli. The picture on the right really doesn't have anything to do with Disraeli or World War I. It's a album cover by a band named Cream, and they had an album called Disraeli Gear, so I just kind of threw that in there. But Benjamin Disraeli is quoted as saying in 1867, in a progressive country, change is constant, and the great question is not whether you should resist change, which is inevitable, but whether that change should be carried out in deference to the manners, the customs, the laws, the traditions of the people, or deference to the abstract principles and arbitrary and general doctrines. One is a national system, the other is a philosophic system. And so what I like about this quote and what I'll use in this quote, or use from this quote, is the middle part, all right? The acknowledgement that change is inevitable. So the change that occurs in World War I or the change in warfare, I think people expect that to happen. The change in the modern world, I think people expect that society and the world as a whole will continue to change and evolve. But how does that change look? Will it be carried out in respect or with homage paid to the traditions and the laws of the people that came before it, or to something totally new and abstract? If we're looking at the countries that might represent the two sides of this argument, I would argue that Great Britain represents the former, that change should be carried out in deference or respect to the manners, the customs, the laws, the traditions of the people, and Germany would represent the latter, that change is going to happen with respect to abstract principles and general doctrines. The thesis that I have laid out here is that World War I is a watershed moment for the modern age, and Europe was in the midst of a conflict, not just on the battlefield but within itself. And one had to ask, what is the purpose of fighting this war? Is this a war to protect the traditions cherished, or to break down the barriers and create a new world based on new ideas? And that's kind of what I'm going to focus my lecture on, is those general ideas there. What's the purpose of fighting this war? Is it to preserve those traditions and those values that people have cherished for generations, or is this to shatter that old world and create a new world based on new ideas? So I like to start with a Christmas truce, and if you want to, I'm not allowed to show YouTube videos using Screencast-O-Matic, but if you want to, the History Channel has a nice 2 to 3 minute clip on the Christmas truce. And the Christmas truce is that I like to focus on is obviously December 25th, 1914, and I like to focus on what's happening south of a place called Ypres, that's in Flanders. And Flanders is in Belgium. And this is the side of the Western Front. Mostly British soldiers are located in Belgium at Ypres and Flanders. And so this is going to be what the Christmas Truce focuses on, is more British soldiers and their interaction and fraternization with German soldiers. So Eckstein argues that this Christmas truce that occurs in 1914 reveals much about the social values and priorities of the opposing armies, and by extension of the nations they represented. He says that because such massive fraternization was to never recur again, it suggests that it wasn't the opening moves of the war. It wasn't the outbreak of the war that changed this world or shattered the old world, but it was the events that followed. And so the question here that we have to answer then is, all right, so what happened post-Christmas of 1914 in World War I, and then how might that alter the values and the attitudes of the men and the people, right, that are involved in this war or affected by this war? So a couple things here, that when this Christmas truce actually occurs, and when people are hearing stories about it afterwards, there was doubt about whether or not this actually happened. Those people that did not actually witness it doubted that it actually happened, and those that did witness it was astonished that it ever did. So why is it so hard to either believe that this Christmas truce happened, and for one day the two sides which had been fighting so intensely against each other could put down their arms and enjoy a day of peace and brotherhood? Why is that so hard to believe? So there's a couple reasons. The fighting in the first 5 months of the war had been so intense, and there was such a high toll in casualties. In the first 5 months, Germany experienced 1 million casualties. Now remember, they're fighting a war on two fronts here. France, by the end of the first 5 months of fighting, they had 300,000 dead and 600,000 killed. Oh, sorry, excuse me, wounded or missing. And the British actually started off with a small trained force, that British Expeditionary Force, or the BEF, and they only numbered about 160,000 to start the war. But they too experienced high casualty tolls, at least in the percentage of soldiers. In one battle, the Battle of Ypres in October to November of 1914, the British, out of that 160,000, they lost 54,000 men. And that's not to count the fighting that they saw in August as well, when we saw the German invasion of Belgium, and we saw British action at places like Mons. The other reason why it's so hard to believe that this happened, or you didn't believe that this happened, is that the propaganda's role in the war, especially on the Anglo-French side. The the English and the French, their propaganda campaign was really to try to portray the Germans as barbarians, to portray the Germans as incapable of human emotions, and this propaganda campaign by the Allies had taken effect by Christmas. So, you know, if you're somebody on the home front and you've been indoctrinated by this message, this constant message by the government that the Germans are less than human, the Germans are barbarians, the Germans are a threat to human decency, and then you hear that your own citizens, right, the good guys, spent one day fraternizing with these horrible people, or less than human people, you wouldn't be able to possibly believe that it's true. But it did happen. Regardless of these two factors, it did happen. And so what this Christmas truce showed was how resilient certain attitudes and values were, in spite of the high casualty tolls, in spite of the propaganda campaigns. But once again, it's important to note that it's the war after the truce, right? And we really want to focus on the war that happens starting in 1916. It's the war after the truce that begins to alter those values, that begins to alter those attitudes that the soldiers had Christmas of 1914. All right, so what is it about the nature of trench warfare that might begin to explain how these attitudes and values of the soldiers on the front lines were altered and how the world subsequently changed as a result of it. So to give us some context as far as how we got to where we were in December of 1914, after the initial opening moves in August and then September of 1914. So we're looking at after the initial moves of the Schlieffen Plan, the German invasion of Belgium. We're looking at Plan 17 being a failure, the Battle of the Frontiers, and culminating with the Battle of the Marne on September 7th, 1914. We saw that the Allies started to push the Germans back, and they started to push the Germans back towards northeastern France, towards the Belgian border. And so what we see happening here that takes place from September to October of 1914 is called the Race to the Sea. And so what we see is that each side was trying to outflank the other and attempt to gain an advantage in the early stages of the war. And what ended up happening was that you saw this trench network go from the English Channel, all right, all the way down to the Swiss border. So as a result of these two sides trying to outflank each other and gain an advantage and continue this war of movement in the opening stages of the war, what ends up happening is you have the two sides deadlocked and pitted against each other in these opposing trenches. This 500-mile front, which we call the Western Front, that's going to characterize World War I, and it's going to take on the nature of trench warfare fighting. And so to get like some more context here, even in the face of this new, you could call it maybe a new theater or a new arena of fighting here on land. The battlefield has changed from previous wars. The military establishments, they still thought, and we're talking about September, October, leading up to Christmas of 1914, they still thought that the war would hinge on one major battle. So, the Germans are still holding on to the premise of the Schlieffen Plan, that decisive blow. And on the Allied side, too, stalemate was impossible to accept. The Entente armies still held firm to the opinion that the offensive spirit was important. And this is going to continue, all the way up until 1916 by both sides. That this is not even in spite of the physical conditions, even in spite of the new technology and the havoc that it will wreak on the battlefield. This still could be a war of movement. And that's really interesting, because there's definitely a gap here between, or a disconnect between the military establishment and the leaders and how they viewed the war, and the soldiers on the front lines who had to go through and carry out these offensives, and these soldiers saw these offensives as senseless slaughter. They experienced and they witnessed the death and carnage on the battlefields due to trench warfare and this new technology, but they didn't see anything accomplished by it. And so, this disconnect between the military establishments and the frontline soldiers, that's going to start to maybe possibly lay the foundation for the Christmas truce in 1914, because both sides here are experiencing, right, this shared misery. The other way that trench warfare took on a nature of its own, or a life of its own, is the weather conditions. The first weather condition that we have to discuss is the rain. I have a quote by Extius that says, from a soldier on the front line, "As winter approached with its endless rains, it turned the field of battle into an impassable, muddy swamp." And so the rain in December was immense. More rain fell on the front in December of 1914 than any December since 1876. Over 6 inches of rain fell on the Western Front. So what does this mean? Well, rifles were clogged with mud and wouldn't fire. The rivers, we talked about the Moose River in the opening moves. We talked about the Sambre River. We talked about the Marne River. These rivers are right next to the front, and these rivers are going to flood. And so that's going to cause some problems, especially if you are fighting essentially in a ditch or the trench. And so soldiers are going to experience water coming up to their knees. On occasion, water is going to come up to their chests, and they have to be hauled out by ropes. Men write in the diaries of witnessing other fellow soldiers drowning in these pools that are created by the immense amount of rain. When we're getting closer to the Christmas truce, we see war diaries in December devote more space to the battle against the elements than the human foe. We see the nature of casualties in the winter of 1914 and 1915 reflect this. Frostbite. We see trench foot. These take a far higher toll on soldiers than actual combat. We see soldiers discussing in their war diaries exhaustion as a result of 3 or 4 days in these conditions. But despite of all this, right? Despite of all this, there's still that mentality by the military establishment that the offensive could happen, and that that you see that these generals still emphasize the need to maintain that offensive spirit. They said it was good for morale. And yeah, morale was a concern, all right, especially due to these physical conditions that these soldiers are experiencing in the trenches. But there was also suspicion by the military establishment that there was an increasingly frequent amount of friendly interchanges with the enemy leading up to Christmas of 1914. And this is to form the basis of the Christmas truce. By Christmas of 1914, you see remarks that there's been a common understanding not to fire or shoot during certain times of the day, especially during meal times. You see that soldiers start to, because they're so close on the Western Front, some of these trenches are no more than 40 yards away. You see that soldiers would banter back and forth. You see soldiers exchanging songs back and forth during the night. There's one British soldier that discusses in a letter home that the Germans, yell over to us every day, inviting us over for dinner. And then one day they held up a piece of blackboard saying, "Why don't you go home, Englishmen, and we can just have peace? All they want is peace." And so, if you're looking at these, at this from the point of view of the military establishment, all right, they said, all right, so these physical conditions that the soldiers are experiencing is lower morale, and as a result of that and that shared misery, we start seeing them becoming friendlier with the enemy. So we got to do something to keep these soldiers focused, and that ended up being the offensive, right? And that ended up being maintaining this mentality that this could be a war of movement. And the officers were also worried for their own lives. This wasn't a fear or suspicion that they were losing their soldiers just in their minds. The French troops, they shot one of their own officers because he did not want to surrender in a hopeless situation. There's a German soldier that wrote in his diary, and he complained about his idiot company commander that forced the men to go out on patrol on Christmas Eve. Of course, fighting broke out, and while him and his fellow soldiers faced death, the commander was behind lines enjoying a drink for Christmas. And Epstein closes the Christmas truce saying that whether physical conditions in the trenches, disappointment with the conduct of the war weighed on the minds of the soldiers in the front lines, these concerns, though, are not enough to explain what happened in or on or around Christmas in 1914. The same factors would appear later in the war, and often in more brutal dimensions. But fraternization on a similar scale would never recur. There was something in the motivation and sensibility of the frontline soldier in December of 1914 that was to disappear as the war progressed. A set of social values and a psychological disposition that were to be drastically altered by the course of the war. What we have to do is we have to look at, all right, so what was this psychological disposition? And then we have to start to hypothesize as we look at the nature of the war and the change in nature of warfare in World War I. How might this alter the mood and the mentality of the soldiers? I want to look at the soldiers and what they thought their purpose of the war was in 1914. And maybe trying to understand why there was so much fraternization on Christmas of 1914. And also I want to look at specifically Great Britain's purpose in the war. The first thing here is why, even if the soldiers didn't question why they were fighting, they knew why they were fighting. They had a clear purpose in December 1914. If this is the case, then why did they have the Christmas truce? Why did they put down their guns and enjoy a day of peace and joy with the enemy? Well, large numbers of reserves were now on the line. These are men in their 30s and 40s. These men, they had wives, they had children. This is the first Christmas away from home, and the thoughts of Christmas at home was just too much, Exine says, and this is going to bring on the fraternization. This will bring on the Christmas truce in 1914. There's also evidence to suggest that younger men were prone to be more aggressive on the front lines, and maybe as the war goes on, the war progresses, and as we see the strategy change to a war of attrition, and as we replace these older reserves or reservists with these young men, maybe that explains why we don't see the Christmas truce happening again in 1916, 1917. That could be one reason. There's also, if we're looking at the British, they're prone to be the more active fraternizers. So why them? Why do the British seem to be such an active participant in the fraternization or the Christmas truce? By looking at what Great Britain thought their purpose of the war was, we can start to find an answer. And before we look at the purpose, and I need to backtrack just a second, another reason why, or another contributing factor as to why Great Britain might be some of the more active participants in the Christmas truce, we do have to remember where this war is being fought. The military threat posed by the Germans affected the British less directly than the French. This war was being fought in Belgium. This war was being fought in France. It wasn't being fought in England. And so this might be another contributing factor for this fraternization. And then looking at Great Britain's purpose, the British had more of a positive purpose or a positive sense as to why they were fighting this war. What was their purpose in the war? It wasn't necessarily to specifically to deny the Germans a navy. It wasn't to specifically deny Germans colonies. It wasn't specifically to deny Germans economic superiority. These were all concerns, and they were all legitimate and serious concerns that the British had. But this wasn't the purpose in the war. This wasn't a war to maintain a balance of power, although this was a long-standing interest of the British, seeing where they were and how they've always maintained that idea of splendid isolation, and were always keen on the interests of maintaining the balance of power in Europe. No, this was a war to preserve a system of British order. This was a war to preserve that sense of civic virtue that the British had. This idea of what it meant, or what the rules were of civilized social conduct. To the British, civilization was only possible if one played the game according to the rules laid down by time. There's that quote that we started off the lecture with, all right? According to the rules laid down by time, history, and precedent. And so when they look and say, who is the enemy? Why are we fighting the Germans? Germany threatened the essence of Great Britain's accomplishment. Germany threatened the values, the social values that Great Britain had struggled to preserve over the years. Germany threatened the essence of the notions of justice and dignity, of civility, that Great Britain had worked so hard to preserve over the years. Germany represented a threat to the respect for law that Great Britain had worked to preserve and to teach and to educate people of their empire and people of the Western world for years. The Germans, according to the British, the Germans had to be defeated, or otherwise civilization itself would be in peril. So if it's this serious, and the British view their purpose in the war, and they as such, and they view the Germans as such a threat, then once again, why the truce? Well, it goes back to the very same values that the British were fighting in the first place. When you play the game, that means you play the game fair, and that means you play the game by the rules. And so in World War I, in December 1914, playing the game to the British, that sense of fair play to the British, that notion of civility that the British are working to preserve, that means leaving the enemy in peace, on the holiest of holy days. That's the central part of the British sense of fair play. That is acting on the values that they are fighting to preserve. Now all this changes in 1916. The war changes in 1916. And as a result, we see the incidents of fraternization dwindle to pretty much nothing. When the nature of war changes, the world changes. And when the world changes, right, your values change. And no longer do the British start to see the enemy as a worthy opponent. But the two sides start to see the enemy as just an idea. It's not the enemy is not something real per se. It's just an idea. It's something abstract. The soldier has become faceless, nameless, unknown. And this is a result of the change in nature that World War I takes on in 1916, 1917. As you see on the PowerPoint, I say that the war can be divided into 4 periods. If you're looking at the Western Front, it can be divided into 4 periods. What we really want to focus on is the war that takes place in 1916, 1917. This is when the thinking of the commanders shift. This is when strategy takes on a new look. This becomes a war of attrition, right? This becomes a war when the two sides are trying to bleed the enemy white. This is when World War I becomes what's known as a total war, and all aspects of society, all resources that a country has, is devoted to the war effort. The workforce is reorganized, where women are now in the factories devoted to the war effort. Industry is changed, is transformed into a wartime economy. Taxation is readjusted and raised to support this war effort. Food is rationed to support the war effort. Civil liberties are suspended or limited to support this war effort. In 1916 and 1917, we see the Germans lead the charge in creating this change. This is reflecting this change of attitude, this change in the practice of warfare. It starts in February of 1916 at the German attack on Verdun. Verdun is located in central eastern France. It's located on the border of Germany and France, near the Alsace-Lorraine region. General Falkenhayn is in charge of the German troops by 1916, and he thinks that the French are on the verge of collapse, and that they might use Verdun as one last attempt as an offensive. And he says that a strong German attack will wear down the French and force them to surrender because they would be exhausted of resources. A strong German attack at Verdun, where he believes that the French would devote every last remaining man and piece of ammunition to save it, would also force the British to counterattack to the north. This would cause enormous casualties and push the British to exhaustion. So in February of 1916, Falkenhayn gets 1,200 pieces of artillery ready for an assault on a front that's only 8 miles long. In the first hours of Verdun in February 1916, February 21st to be exact, right, the Germans are going to launch over 1 million shells on the French at Verdun. And Falkenhayn says that this is going to be a war where I bleed the enemy white. For every 2 German lives I lose, the French would lose 5. Now, as we see what happens at Verdun, that doesn't quite work out. Now, he does drain the French of some serious manpower. By November of 1916, the French will lose over 500,000 men. And now Falkenhayn is right that the British will launch a counterattack to the north, and the British are going to mount the greatest offensive ever seen by any British army, and it will be on the Somme River, and it will start July of 1916. However, this is a new war fought with new weapons. And so when the British mount this offensive here at the battle at the Somme River in July of 1916, they use 19th century strategies in a changing world fought with 20th century weapons. So on that first day of the Somme, it's the most catastrophic and devastating event that the British Army has ever witnessed. 60,000 British men will lose their lives at the Somme in the first day. By November of 1916, another 500,000 will be killed or wounded. Remember the Somme when we talk about why Neville Chamberlain chooses appeasement over force in dealing with Hitler. When Neville Chamberlain is asked why he won't use force against Hitler, he says one word: the Somme. This is the war that has emerged as a result of the technology that you guys researched the other day. It is a war where the traditional notions of warfare become reversed. The defender is now the hero, and the attacker is now the victim. This is a war where there's no objective in gaining a certain territory or a certain amount of land. The only objective is just to completely slaughter and kill off as many as the other side as you can before they kill you. This is the war that's going to alter those values, that psychological disposition that we witnessed in December of 1914. A couple other key features of trench warfare that might go along with the change in values and attitudes. Etkins paints this great picture. He says a panorama of devastation confronted the soldiers in the major battle zones. He uses a quote by a British soldier named Paul Nash. He says, "Sunrise and sunset are blasphemous. Only the black rain of the bruised and swollen clouds is fit atmosphere in such a land. The rain drives on, the stinking mud becomes more evilly yellow, the shell holes fill up with green-white water, the roads and tracks are covered in inches of slime, the black dying trees ooze of sweat, and the shells never cease. They plunge into the grave which is this land. It is unspeakable, godless, hopeless." Now that last part is unspeakable, godless, and hopeless. That doesn't sound like a man who is willing to forgive and forget for a day. That doesn't sound like a man who's ready to celebrate Christmas. That doesn't sound like a man who's willing to engage in the rules or this British sense of fair play. No, this sounds like a man whose mind has been drastically altered by what he's experienced and what he has survived. Now, there's other things that we can talk about with as far as the key features of trench warfare, and we can talk about this in class when we have some of these quotes in front of me. We could talk about the dirt and the filth that are constant companions in the trenches. We can talk about how the soldiers are constantly soaked to the bone because of all the rain. They're constantly freezing where no amount of clothing helps. We could talk about the winter nights that are impossibly cold. We could talk about how these conditions, right, create an environment where food couldn't be enjoyed, where the strain of battle reduces appetites even further. We could talk about the lice that the soldiers had to battle, or the rats that they had to fend off each night. We could talk about the nights where sleep was impossible. We could talk about the sheer amount of death that surrounds the battlefield. And with that death, it doesn't get cleaned up, so you have decomposition, the decomposing bodies, right, all over no man's land. The odor that is emanating from these dead bodies. The clouds of flies that are attracted. You can talk about how men experience and witness limbs and torsos that are churned up again and again by the constant shelling. Or how when working parties are digging and repairing trenches, they repeatedly uncover corpses in all stages of decay and mutilation. Or how fragments of bodies find their way into sandbags in the trenches. Soldier says that we all had the stench of death. The bread we ate, the stagnant water we drank, everything we touched had a rotten smell. I want to leave you when we're looking at, or what's important when we're looking at this new style of fighting with trench warfare. And we look at the new phase of war in 1916, 1917, this war of attrition. What's important is that this 1916 or 1917 phase of war, this style of fighting with trench warfare and this new technology, what's important is how does this relate to previous forms of warfare? How does this new war and the attitudes that come with it, how does this relate to the expectations and the values that soldiers and citizens had entering the war in the summer of 1914? When you look at the war in 1916 and 1917, when you look at things like Verdun and the Somme and just trench warfare in general, when you look at it and you look at it in as far as how it relates to what came before it, it is hard to deny that something new has taken place. Something that would fundamentally transform warfare and the world as we know it. We'll talk more about this in class.